Every year on March 8th, we're surrounded by flowers, congratulations, and all these messages of appreciation. It really feels like a day to celebrate femininity. But what if I told you that the gentle image we see today hides a story of, well, ideological violence, intense political maneuvering, and two completely opposite visions for what the future of women should even be? Let's peel back the petals and uncover the story hidden behind the flowers. So, you think you know this holiday, right? But what if the story we've all been told is really only half the picture? What if those flowers aren't just for celebrating, but maybe for concealing a history that's a lot more complex, and frankly, a lot darker than we imagine?
See, the thing is, March 8th wasn't born from some single unified movement. Not at all. It's actually the result of a massive collision between two powerful currents that were happening at the exact same time. One fighting for women as free individuals, and the other fighting to use them as tools for a revolution.
And that right there brings us to the central conflict of this day. This is a story about how a genuine human struggle for dignity got completely tangled up with a political machine that promised liberation, but, as we'll see, often delivered the exact opposite.
So, on one side of the ring, you've got the Western suffragettes. Their entire focus was on personal freedom and civil rights, all within the framework of a democracy. And on the other side, you have the radical socialists in the East. Their goal wasn't individual liberty at all. It was a total, complete restructuring of society through class struggle. These were two completely different worlds with two completely different endgames. Okay, so how on earth did these two fundamentally different visions end up sharing a cause, and eventually even a day? Let's start by unpacking the democratic pillar of this whole story.
The suffragettes' whole idea was, revolutionary, but also incredibly simple. They argued that without the right to vote, a woman just wasn't a true citizen. She was a subject, legally under the thumb of her father or her husband. The vote wasn't just about politics for them. It was about being recognized as a full, independent human being.
And they weren't asking for the moon either. Their goals were incredibly practical. They wanted the right to own their own property, to sign contracts, to go to university, and to enter professions like law and medicine. And their methods were all about changing the system from within, holding protests, lobbying politicians, and making their case in the court of public opinion.
All right, now let's flip the coin and look at the other side. The socialist movement, championed by figures like Clara Zetkin, saw things completely differently. For them, women's rights were never the main goal. The woman question, as they called it, was always secondary to the bigger prize, a global communist revolution directed by the Comintern. And let's be crystal clear, the goal here was absolutely not about empowering individual women. It was about capturing women as a resource, a workforce, and a pool of militants to help destroy the old order. Institutions like the family and the church, which competed with the state for people's loyalty, had to be dismantled. The individual was nothing. The collective was everything. So, you've got these two movements on a collision course. One wants to reform democracy, the other wants to literally burn it all down. How in the world do they end up sharing a date on the calendar? Well, the answer is just pure political pragmatism. And wow, things moved fast. In 1910, Clara Zetkin floats the idea of an International Women's Day. But the real turning point comes in March 1917. A women's strike in St. Petersburg for bread and peace accidentally becomes the spark that ignites the entire Russian Revolution. The Bolsheviks immediately grabbed onto this date and turned it into a powerful founding myth. And just 2 years later, the West would get its first real, terrifying look at what this liberation meant in practice. Despite their massive ideological differences, both groups were slamming into the same wall: political systems run entirely by men. The socialists knew they couldn't get labor laws changed without the vote, and the suffragettes knew their protests didn't have enough muscle without the huge numbers of working-class women. So for a brief, crucial moment, it was an enemy of my enemy is my friend's situation. They needed each other.
But here's the crucial question. What actually happened when that socialist vision won? What did their version of equality look like in the real world? This is where the story takes a very, very dark turn, moving from political theory to documented reality.
So in 1919, the U.S. Senate put together something called the Overman Committee to investigate this new Bolshevik regime. And the stories they heard from refugees fleeing Russia, well, they sent absolute shockwaves across the Western world. It was the first official report that detailed what was really happening behind all the propaganda.
I mean, the language from the testimonies was just horrifying. Witnesses were talking about the nationalization of women, a chilling concept where women were treated not as individuals, but as property of the state. The family itself was deliberately targeted for destruction because it was seen as a bourgeois institution that stood in the way of total loyalty to the party.
So for a lot of women, you can imagine, this was not liberation, not even close. It was just a new kind of servitude. They were freed from the authority of their husbands, only to be put under the absolute authority of the state. They were suddenly expected to work grueling hours in factories for the state and then go home and continue all their traditional roles. A double whammy. Now, all of this wasn't just happening in a bubble. Let's zoom in and see how this played out in a country literally right on the border of this new Soviet empire, Romania, because the stories coming out of Russia had a profound and lasting impact there. You see, feminism in Romania took a completely different path. The horror stories from just across the fence acted as a powerful brake on the movement. Any call for radical social change was immediately linked to the terror of Bolshevism. So the movement became much more moderate, focusing on things like cultural work and national unity, and it stayed far away from radical politics to avoid being labeled anti-Romanian. And then, after World War II, when communism was forced on Romania, the propaganda of equality became a very harsh reality. This so-called equality of steel, where women were pushed into heavy industry as comrades, left a scar. It created this deep-seated suspicion around the very word feminism that, honestly, you can still see in parts of Eastern Europe to this day.
Which brings us all the way back to the beginning, and back to our original question. When we celebrate March 8th, which of these two legacies are we actually honoring? Are we celebrating the fight for the individual, or the ideology that hijacked that fight for its own purposes?
So when you boil it all down, you're left with these two totally different models. On one hand, you have the suffragette's citizen woman, who fights for rights to be free from state control so she can make her own choices. And on the other, you have the Comintern's tool woman, who is granted rights so she can better serve the state, becoming completely dependent on it. So the next time you see those flowers on March 8th, maybe pause for a second and ask yourself, what are we really celebrating here? Is it the hard-won victory for the woman as a free, sovereign individual? Or are we, without even knowing it, celebrating the victory of an ideology that got really, really good at using flowers to hide its chains?